Hello everybody, I'm Gwen Campbell-Mindes. Welcome to Gwen's Bookish Ramblings, and I wound up on book 2 of this series, even though I wasn't really planning on it because I just can't help myself with reading books in, orders. Anyways, so The Curse of the Pharaohs is, let's be honest, kind of inevitable with any period book about Egyptology. Curses of the Pharaohs have been a cheerful central topic of Egyptian stuff since, well, the 1800s, when everybody was opening up tombs in Egypt and oohing and eyeing over things and then getting themselves killed with all kinds of exotic diseases or getting run over by carriages and blaming the whole thing on an Egyptian curse because, frankly, that's a great deal more sensational than saying, yes, I got malaria or got run over by a carriage because I wasn't looking where I was going. So you have. So the interesting thing about this book, of course, this is a sequel to the first one, and the thing about the first one is that the first one is very much a complete story in and of itself. You have this woman who thinks she's never going to get married. She goes to Egypt. She discovers love of Egyptology. She finds an Egyptologist. They fall in love. At the end of the book, they're basically married. And it's sort of, wrapped up neatly with a bow. So when you start this book, you have this woman basically talking about, I suppose you could call it the post-happily ever after problem. It's the criticism that people have about fairy tales that, nobody's going to actually live constantly and consistently and endlessly happily ever after. You don't just sort of enter a state of blissful stasis for the rest of eternity. You have a life. And so this book opens up with the fact that, she's gotten married and now she has a life. She and her husband are married. They now have a son who is apparently very intelligent, but also very curious and very active. He rather reminds one actually of an even younger Calvin, of Calvin and Hobbes, just sort of that active imagination, that intelligence, that desperate need to claim that, this bone that you find is a dinosaur bone. In his case, he starts off with that, but gradually his father talks him down to something a little more realistic, but he's still insisting that it has to be a zebra bone, while his father says, no, this is a horse bone. You have that. And their son is basically 3 years old. He's very young. He's only just started talking. He has a speech impediment because he's only just learning how to talk. You have all of these things. What's very interesting, of course, is that Amelia Peabody is what one might term at the time an unnatural woman, in that right after her son was born, she and her husband, Emerson, instead of sticking around to coo at their son for a year, basically left their son with her sister-in-law, because Emerson has a brother, and Amelia's sidekick, Evelyn, had gotten married to the brother, and they basically just left their son, who they nickname Ramses and always call Ramses, such that I'm not sure I will ever remember his actual name. They just left him with Walter and Evelyn and take off for Egypt because there's a dig going on that they're both way more interested in. And so that's what they do. And they come back and they meet their son, who has, grown in the time that they've been gone and is now starting to talk, and basically kind of hypnotizes Emerson with having this little tiny person who is, shockingly smart but still a little tiny ignorant person. And for a while that sort of tides them over, but and this is sort of described over in passing as stuff that happened in the first chapter of the book, but basically Amelia says that Emerson is starting to get desperate because he is an on the ground active digging paleontologist, archaeologist. Yes, I do know the difference. It was a slip of the tongue. I've been watching a lot of paleontology videos lately on YouTube, so sue me. Anyways, he's a very on-the-ground digging kind of archaeologist. He likes to be there getting his hands dirty, seeing the tombs for the first time, but also he is part of that revolution within the context of this, piece of historical fiction, part of that revolution in archaeology that started to happen as we hit the end of the Victorian era, that revolution of treating archaeology as more than just let's get a bunch of loot and stick it somewhere and show off that there's this beautiful loot that we found. That, it's about finding pot shards and figuring out what those pot shards were made and were what those pot shards made up, and figuring out what it is that people did with their lives and how they put things together, and all of those details that make archaeology what it is, the things that turn it from sensationalism into an actual science. Because in the end, the archaeological dig is not just to find neat stuff, it's to learn about dead societies. It's to learn about cultures that are long gone, that you can't just investigate by, walking down to the marketplace and watching things go past. You want to learn about modern Italian culture, you can go to Rome and you can watch people walk around down there and eat and learn the language and see the food that they're selling in stores and see the kinds of decorations that people have in their homes and so on and so forth. You don't have to go out of your way to do that. And it's the same with any other current still living culture. But something like ancient Egypt, it's a culture that's been dead for thousands of years. It's a culture that we don't speak the language anymore. We don't know what it actually sounds like. We have the ongoing theories, as described in this book, that in the first book she speaks of Kuenaten, which her brother-in-law, Emerson's brother, thinks eventually comes to the notion that it's actually Akhenaten, which has to do with how hieroglyphics work and how they're a Semitic language. And as I recall, which I grant I have not looked at this in a long time because Egypt has never been massively of interest to me, no more than anyone else, who is like 7 years old wandering through a museum is interested. But as I recall, hieroglyphics are like Hebrew and Arabic and some other Semitic languages. They are a language without vowel letters. Hebrew is a language without vowel letters. You have the nikudot, which are sort of like a bunch of dots that you stick around things that indicate what vowels are supposed to be there, but the thing about those is those are actually just for children, that once you get fluent in the language, you're supposed to not need that anymore because you can tell what the word is because you know the language. And as I understand it, hieroglyphics is kind of like that you have a whole bunch of, part of it is pictographic, part of it is not, it is not alphabetic in the way that we think, where we have a bunch of letters, each of which connects to a specific sound. But the point is that it was something that didn't have vowels, and so people kind of had to figure out vowels. You stitch together that this combination of letters, again, coming out of the Rosetta Stone, where you know that this combination of symbols made this sound, so you see that combination of symbols again, and it must also make that sound. And so you sort of work around and backwards from that kind of thing. But that leaves a lot of gaps, and So people have sort of developed better ideas over time as they've come to know the language better. And so the point of this side issue is that in this very book, she is reminded that it is not Kuenaten after all, that her brother-in-law thinks that it's Akhenaten. And so, but archaeology, it's a thing. Anyways, back to the actual book, I guess. So Emerson, he wants to be doing that. And part of the reason that he wants to be on the ground is because he doesn't trust anyone else to get it right. It's one of his biggest problems is people who go in there and they take a bunch of crap out of a tomb or whatever, and they say, "Ooh, look at us, we're doing archaeology," when in point of fact they're going in there, they're taking a bunch of stuff out of a tomb and waving it in the air, and that's not science. And so he kind of wants to be there in no small part because he wants to do it right, but also because, the exciting part of archaeology, like paleontology, like so many other sciences, is the part where you get to go down, get your hands dirty, and actually make exciting discoveries, because everything else is a long slog of academia and research and paper writing and grimly digging through tiny little details to stitch things together, which is the reason why you will never catch me dead in academia. Because, wow, I don't want to do that. So they get visited. So the book opens after, sort of this filling in all of these things that we have missed in the past year, with Amelia explaining how she was trying to convince a woman, another woman of the same class as she is, to let Emerson have a crack at a Viking burial mound on her property, because at least it would be giving him something that was, a thing to do. Anyways, but they are visited by Lady Baskerville, no relation to the Sherlock Holmes story, who, after flirting unmercifully with Emerson, basically talks them around into talks Emerson into coming to Egypt, and he's not coming without his wife. They get talked into coming to Egypt to take over the digging up of a tomb that is currently in abeyance because Lord Baskerville died and everybody thinks it was a curse. And, there have been a bunch of deaths and disappearances surrounding it, and everybody, again, thinks it's a curse. Emerson doesn't think it's a curse and shows up and tries and, takes over the dig. There are a series of murders and events and excitement, and there is a murder investigation. And as in the last book, I rarely like I'm rarely a very big fan of an unreliable narrator, but Amelia Peabody is that most entertaining of unreliable narrators, that a person who is commonsensical, is not misperceiving the world, but occasionally has perceptions of things that are, one feels, perhaps not entirely connected to reality. And I say this, of course, because of that last book and my favorite bits in it, which are just her saying she was looking forward to an opportunity to amputate stuff because she just thought it would be so exciting. She's just kind of like that. Anyhow, this book is great fun. It has as much curse and drama in it as the last one. There is a side romance. Actually, there is a love quadrangle, I think. There's a lot of cross back and forth stuff in that way in this book. It's a good time. Also, there's a cat. So, cats. And that's everything. And I will see you all next week.